Put her on the phone. I said put her on, Tae-young roared, his knuckles white as he gripped the device. But the voice on the other end wasn't speaking Korean. It was Mandarin, fast, angry, and unintelligible to him. The most dangerous man in Seoul was helpless. He looked at his men. None of them understood. He was about to lose the only person he loved. Then, a soft hand reached out. Not a soldier, not a lieutenant. It was Chloe, the maid he hadn't spoken 10 words to in a year. The one he thought couldn't even read a grocery list. "Give me the phone," she said, her voice commanding. Before he could stop her, she snatched it, and when she opened her mouth, it wasn't a plea. It was the sharp, terrifying hiss of perfect Mandarin.
听好了，别碰它。我们现在重新谈判，别耍花样。
The room went deathly silent. The screaming on the other end of the line stopped instantly. Tae-young watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the woman who dusted his shelves dismantled a triad kill order with 3 sentences. She didn't just speak the language, she spoke the code. She used the ghost dialect, slang only high-ranking triad enforcers knew. Location confirmed, North Warehouse. We send the money, you send the mother. No tricks, she said, switching effortlessly to English for Tae-young's benefit, then back to Mandarin to seal the deal. She listened for one final confirmation, nodded once, and ended the call. The silence that followed was heavier than the panic before it. Chloe turned around, her face returning to a mask of calm indifference. She held the phone out to him. "Your mother is safe, sir. They will drop her at the border of the district in 20 minutes. Tae-young didn't take the phone. He looked at her hand, steady, unshakable, then up to her eyes. The dull, submissive look he was used to was gone. Beneath it was something cold, something lethal. "Who?" Tae-young whispered, his voice trembling for the first time that night. "Who the hell are you?" Chloe placed the phone gently on the desk since he wouldn't take it. She smoothed out her apron, her expression unreadable. "Just the maid, sir," she said softly. "I noticed you're out of scotch. I'll go fetch a refill." She turned to walk away as if she hadn't just saved his empire. "Stop!" Tae-young barked, stepping over the desk, his shock turning into a desperate need for answers. "You are not going anywhere. Like this video right now if you love seeing the underdog take absolute control. We all know there is nothing more satisfying than a powerful man realizing he made a huge mistake. Tap that like button if you are ready to see the Dragon of Seoul get schooled by the Queen of Silence. The view from the penthouse in Gangnam was worth millions, but to Chloe Jackson, it was just another surface to clean. For 6 months, she had been the invisible ghost haunting the edges of Choi Tae-young's life, a silent observer in the court of a kingpin. She moved through the sprawling, cold apartment with the rhythm of someone who knew that invisibility was the only way to survive in the den of a Korean mafia boss. She scrubbed the imported Italian marble floors until her knees ached, her eyes lowered, her posture intentionally submissive. To the outside world, she was a striking black woman in a foreign land. To Tae-young, she was merely part of the overhead costs, efficient but ultimately irrelevant. Tae-young stormed into the room, a whirlwind of expensive cologne and suppressed violence. He was shirtless, the intricate dragon tattoo on his chest rippling as he paced aggressively, his phone pressed tight to his ear. He was the feared head of the 7-star syndicate, a ruthless CEO of the underworld who commanded absolute terror from the toughest gangsters in Seoul. Yet he treated Chloe with a casual indifference one might show a piece of furniture. He didn't even lower his voice as he discussed the details of a heroin shipment docking in Incheon. He simply assumed the woman polishing his coffee table was too simple to comprehend the complexity of his crimes. "Incompetence! Everyone around me is useless!" Taeyong roared into the phone, switching rapidly between business Korean and broken English. He stopped directly in front of Chloe. He didn't step around her. He waited for her to scurry out of his way, like a mouse avoiding a boot. Chloe moved instantly, head bowed, clutching her rag to her chest, making herself small. "You were as bad as the help, Minho," Taeyong sneered into the receiver, gesturing carelessly at Chloe with his free hand, though his eyes looked right through her. "Look at this woman. She's been here half a year and hasn't learned a single word of our language apart from yes and sorry. She probably thinks I run a logistics company. It's pathetic." He laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed off the glass walls. "I could leave the ledger open on the counter and she wouldn't know what she was looking at. She's probably illiterate, a blunt instrument, just like you." Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't grip the rag tighter. She didn't bite her lip. She had trained herself to be stone. But behind her lowered lashes, her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and calculating. She wasn't just cleaning, she was cataloging. She knew he didn't run a logistics company. She knew the shipment was late. She knew his mother's birthday was tomorrow, and she understood every cruel, arrogant word he spat out in Korean. He thought he was living with a harmless, uneducated servant, completely unaware that he was housing a woman who could dismantle his operation with a whisper. He wanted a ghost, so she gave him one, but he had forgotten that ghosts are the very things that come back to haunt you. The neon pulse of Seoul didn't just shine on Choi Tae-young, it seemed to bend around him, terrified to touch the man who held the city's underworld in a chokehold. As the head of the seven-star syndicate, Tae-young was a figure carved from ice and violence, a ruthless Korean mafia boss whose whisper could level businesses in Gangnam, and whose silence was more terrifying than a scream. To his rivals, he was the dragon of the Han River, a man without a soul, capable of ordering a hit without blinking. But as the heavy steel doors of his private sanctuary clicked shut, locking out the grime of the criminal empire he ruled, the monster vanished, leaving behind only a devoted son. He walked softly down the hallway, the sound of his Italian leather shoes muted by thick carpets, shedding his aura of menace with every step. He stopped at the entrance of the sunroom, checking his reflection to ensure no blood splatter or disheveled clothing would betray the brutal negotiation he had just finished. Taking a deep breath, he slid the paper screen door open. The air inside smelled of jasmine tea and old paper, a stark contrast to the scent of gunpowder and fear that usually clung to him. Sitting by the window, bathed in the soft afternoon light, was his mother. She was frail, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged a vase of lilies, the only person in the world who didn't see a killer when she looked at him. "You're late, Tae-young-ah," she scolded gently without turning around, her voice thin but filled with warmth. The man who had just broken a rival's arm for disrespecting him bowed his head in genuine shame. He crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair with a tenderness that would have shocked his lieutenants. The hands that wielded knives and pistols with deadly precision now moved with infinite care as he took the flower shears from her shaking grip to help her cut a stubborn stem. "I was working, Oma," he murmured, his voice dropping to a soft, respectful rumble. "Just business." He peeled a Korean pear for her, slicing the fruit into perfect bite-sized pieces, watching her eat with a fierce, protective obsession. She was his heart, the only pure thing left in his corrupt life. Every bribe he paid, every war he waged was to keep this room safe, to keep the darkness of the Seoul underworld from touching the hem of her dress. He brushed a stray lock of gray hair from her forehead, his eyes burning with a terrifying promise. He would burn the entire city to ash if anyone dared to threaten her peace. He was the dragon, yes, but she was the only treasure he guarded. He didn't know that outside the glass, the wolves were already circling, preparing to tear his heart out. Even monsters have a heart, and that is what makes them dangerous. Hit subscribe if you want to see how far a man will go for the only woman he loves. Join our community. We appreciate characters who are brutal to the world but gentle to their own. Don't miss a single beat of this story. The obsidian conference table reflected the terrified faces of the men gathered around it, but Choi Tae-young saw only their weakness. He leaned back in his leather chair, a predator toying with wounded prey. The silence in the room stretched until the air felt too thin to breathe. This was the meeting that would solidify the Seven-Star Syndicate's absolute control over the southern ports, and Tae-young was methodically dissecting the rival boss sitting opposite him with words sharper than any sashimi knife. He was in his element, a king on his throne, untouchable and absolute. The city outside was just a chessboard, and he had already won. Then the impossible happened. A phone rang, not the encrypted business line that his lieutenants monitored, but the private cell phone that sat face down on the table, the number only one person in the world possessed. The sound was jarring, a cheerful, mundane melody that had no place in a room filled with hardened murderers. Tae-young held up his hand, silencing his lieutenant mid-sentence. He flipped the phone over, his annoyance instantly vanishing as the name Oma flashed on the screen. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his dark eyes. She knew never to call during business hours unless it was a matter of life and death. The room watched, paralyzed, as the ruthless Mafia boss pressed the phone to his ear, his voice dropping from a growl to a gentle, concerned whisper. "Oma, is everything all right?" The answer was not his mother's warm greeting. It was the sound of a struggle, a sharp cry of pain that sounded like glass breaking, followed by the terrifying, muffled sobbing of an elderly woman. The blood drained from Tae-young's face so violently that he looked like a ghost had just walked into the room. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure panic that shattered his icy composure in an instant. "Oma!" he shouted, standing up so abruptly his heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the floor. The rival gangsters flinched, reaching for their concealed weapons, assuming the meeting had turned into a hit, but Tae-young didn't even see them. They had ceased to exist. "Who is this? If you touch her, I will kill you all," he roared, his voice cracking with a desperation his men had never heard. The response was not a negotiation he could understand. It was a barrage of aggressive, rapid-fire speech, but it wasn't. The air in the boardroom had turned poisonous, thick with the scent of fear and the electric tension of a disaster unfolding in real time. Choi Tae-young, the untouchable dragon of the Han River, was pacing like a caged animal, his usually immaculate suit jacket discarded on the floor, sweat beading on his forehead. He gripped the phone so tightly the screen threatened to crack, shouting into the device in a desperate, chaotic mix of Korean and English. "Money! You want money? Dawn! Cash?" he roared, his voice bouncing off the soundproof glass walls. "I give you 5 billion won, right now. Just tell me where." He was throwing numbers into the void, sums that would buy entire neighborhoods in Seoul, trying to suffocate the problem with wealth, the only tool he had never known to fail. But the voice on the other end didn't care about his billions. It was a jagged, aggressive stream of noise that Tae-young couldn't decipher. It sounded like Mandarin, but twisted, guttural, and far too fast. A rough, coastal dialect that chewed up the words and spat them out like gravel. Tae-young looked wildly at his lieutenants, his eyes wide with a terrifying vulnerability. "Translate!" he screamed at them. "Someone tell me what he is saying." The hardened gangsters looked at each other in helpless silence, terrified to admit that their brutality had no use here. One lieutenant stepped forward, stammering, "Boss, it's Chinese, but I don't understand the words. It's slang. It's too fast." Tae-young cursed, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. He tried to bluff, to regain the upper hand through sheer willpower. "You listen to me," he bellowed into the phone, his voice dropping to that lethal register that usually made men wet themselves. "If you touch one hair on her head, I will find you. I will burn your entire lineage to the ground." It was a death sentence that should have frozen the blood of any criminal in Asia, but the language barrier turned his terrifying threat into meaningless noise. The kidnapper didn't hear the promise of torture. He only heard a man shouting, a man who wasn't complying. The reaction was instant and horrifying. The voice on the phone spiked in volume, turning into a screech of pure rage. The kidnapper thought Tae-young was stalling. He thought the offer of money was a mockery. Through the speaker, the sickening sound of a heavy blow landed, followed by his mother's sharp, broken wail of pain. "No!" Tae-young screamed, his bluff shattering instantly into a million pieces. The connection crackled with the kidnapper's fury, the tone unmistakable even without the words. "Time is up. You are playing games. Now she bleeds." The misunderstanding wasn't just a delay, it was an escalation. Tae-young stood amidst his empire of guns and money, realizing with nauseating clarity that he was completely impotent against a man he couldn't understand. This is the definition of a nightmare. Money can't fix it. Violence can't fix it. Comment below. If you were in Tae-young's shoes, would you trust the invisible maid to save your family, or is that too big of a risk? Let me know your strategy in the comments. The silence that followed the mother's scream was broken by a single guttural command that transcended the language barrier. "U Fanzong," the voice barked, the harsh syllables cracking like a whip. Then, in a jagged, broken attempt at English that sounded more like a growl, the kidnapper spat out the translation. 5 minutes. The line didn't go dead, it just hung there, open and breathing, a terrifying live feed into the nightmare unfolding somewhere in the city. The message was absolute. There were no more negotiations, no more bluffs. The countdown had begun, and with every second that ticked by, Choi Tae-young's world crumbled a little further into the abyss. Tae-young stared at the phone on the mahogany table as if it were a bomb. Then the explosion came from him. With a roar of primal, impotent fury, he swept his arm across the desk, sending a crystal decanter of scotch and a priceless Ming vase shattering against the far wall. The destruction was instant and violent. He kicked over a heavy leather chair, his chest heaving, his tattoos glistening with sweat under the harsh office lights. "Find them!" he screamed at his men, his voice raw with panic. "Trace the call! Tear this city apart! Do something!" But his lieutenants stood frozen, paralyzed by their own uselessness. They were soldiers, not magicians, without a location, without a language they could understand. Their guns were nothing but dead weight. The most powerful mafia boss in Seoul was reduced to a madman in a cage, thrashing against the bars of his own ignorance, while the woman who gave him life counted down her final breaths. In the corner of the chaotic room, almost blending into the shadows, Chloe Jackson stopped moving. She had been on her knees, scrubbing a phantom stain from the marble floor, flinching instinctively as the glass shattered near her. But she didn't run. Instead, her head tilted slightly to the side, her body going unnaturally still. Her eyes, usually dull and submissive when Tae-young looked at her, narrowed with a sharp, piercing intensity. She focused on the open line, on the faint, hushed conversations happening in the background on the kidnapper's end. She heard it, not just the Mandarin, but the specific rhythmic cadence of the dialect. It wasn't the standard dialect taught in schools. It was a rough coastal slang, a ghost dialect used by the smuggling triads of the southern ports. She recognized the stress on the vowels, the specific curse words they used to mock the crying woman. It was a language of blood and salt, one she hadn't heard in years, but one she knew as intimately as her own name. Tae-young was screaming orders to check the north side, completely wrong, blindly guessing. Chloe watched him, her grip on the cleaning rag tightening until her knuckles turned white. He was going to let his mother die because he was too arrogant to see the answer standing 5 feet away in a maid's uniform. The clock was ticking, and the mask of the invisible, illiterate help was becoming too heavy to wear. 3 minutes. That was all that stood between Choi Tae-young and the execution of his heart. The countdown hung over the office like a guillotine blade, the silence of the room punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the dragon of soul. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for a miracle that wasn't coming. His lieutenants had retreated to the walls, unable to watch their king crumble, their faces pale with the knowledge that they had failed him. Tae-young gripped the phone, his thumb hovering over the red button, terrified that the next sound he heard would be the final gunshot. He was a man drowning in an ocean of his own power, realizing too late that his money could not buy understanding and his violence could not translate a dialect he didn't speak. Then, movement cut through the paralysis. It wasn't the frantic running of a soldier or the arrival of backup. It was the slow, deliberate rise of the maid. Chloe Jackson dropped the cleaning rag she had held for 6 months. It hit the floor with a wet thud, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tense quiet. She didn't look at the broken glass. She stepped over it. She didn't look at the armed guards. She walked past them as if they were ghosts. Her posture had changed. The slump of the subservient worker was gone, replaced by the rigid, predatory grace of a soldier entering a kill zone. She walked straight toward the desk, her eyes locked on the phone in Tae-young's hand. Tae-young saw her out of the corner of his peripheral vision, and his panic instantly curdled into rage. How dare she? How dare this invisible, illiterate creature interrupt his final moments of grief? He spun toward her, baring his teeth. "Get out," he screamed, his veins in his neck bulging. "Get out of here, woman. I said leave." He waved his hand dismissively, expecting her to flinch, to cower, to scurry back to the shadows where she belonged. But Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't stop. She kept coming, closing the distance between the master and the servant until she was standing inside his personal guard, a place no one was allowed to be. "I said get back," Tae-young roared, raising his hand as if to shove her away. "Are you deaf? Are you stupid? Get—" He never finished the sentence. Chloe didn't ask for permission. She didn't offer an apology. With a speed that blurred the air, she reached out. Her hand, the one he thought was only good for scrubbing floors, clamped onto his wrist with the crushing strength of a vice. Tae-young gasped, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. The grip was not that of a maid, it was the grip of a combatant. Before his brain could process the insurrection, she twisted his wrist and ripped the phone from his grasp. The device transferred from the most dangerous man in Seoul to the black woman he had underestimated for half a year. The hierarchy of the room shattered instantly. She brought the phone to her ear, her eyes cold, dead, and terrifyingly focused. The shock encounter was complete. The maid had taken the throne. And this is the moment we were all waiting for. If you felt that rush of satisfaction when Chloe grabbed that phone, smash the like button again. We need to push this video in the algorithm so everyone can see that true power isn't about shouting, it's about competence. Let's get this scene to the top. The silence in the room was absolute. A vacuum created by the sudden shift in power. Choi Tae-young stood frozen, his hand still suspended in the air where his phone had been, his wrist throbbing from the shocking grip of the woman he had dismissed as furniture. He stared at Chloe Jackson, but the person standing before him was a stranger. The slumped shoulders were gone, replaced by a spine of steel. The averted gaze was now a laser-focused stare fixed on the reflection in the glass window. She didn't look at the armed lieutenants who had raised their weapons in confusion. She didn't even look at the Mafia boss she had just disarmed. She simply pressed the phone to her ear and, with a terrifying calm, began to speak. The words that spilled from her lips were Mandarin, but not the Mandarin taught in universities or spoken by tourists. It was high triad slang, a dense, coded dialect of the underworld, dripping with the specific menace of the Shanghai docks. To Tae-young's ears, it was a rapid-fire stream of sharp consonants and tonal shifts, but the narration of the moment translated the brutality of her message. She wasn't pleading for her mother's life. She was giving orders. "You are holding the dragon's heart," she hissed, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, vibrating growl that commanded instant submission. "You think you are wolves? You are stray dogs barking at thunder." Tae-young's jaw went slack. He watched, mouth agape, as the illiterate Maid paced his office with the predatory grace of a seasoned enforcer. She used terms that only high-ranking syndicate members would know, words for safe passage, blood debt, and territory that were centuries old. She was cold, precise, and utterly terrifying. "The drop is moved," she commanded, cutting off whatever protest the kidnapper tried to make. "Warehouse 19, the blind side. If she has a single bruise, if she sheds a single tear, I will not send money. I will send the butcher. I will send the butcher." That line was absolute ice. If you felt the adrenaline spike when Chloe dropped that threat, hit the like button right now. We are watching a master at work, and the algorithm needs to know that this is the kind of powerful storytelling we want. Let's get this video trending. She paused, listening to the frantic stammering on the other end. The kidnappers who had been laughing at Tae-young only moments ago were now silent, terrified by the voice of a woman who clearly outranked them in the hierarchy of violence. Chloe's expression didn't change. She was a statue of ice. 20 minutes, she said, delivering the ultimatum with the finality of a judge passing a death sentence. "Do not make me come for you." She pulled the phone away from her ear and pressed the end call button with a thumb that didn't tremble even slightly. The connection was severed, but the shockwave of her performance was just beginning to tear through the room. Tae-young looked at her, his world turned upside down, realizing with a sick feeling in his gut that the most dangerous thing in his penthouse wasn't him. The convoy of armored black sedans tore through the industrial district of Incheon like a pack of wolves on a blood scent, ignoring traffic lights and speed limits. Choi Tae-young was behind the wheel of the lead vehicle, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel with lethal intensity. The GPS coordinates blinking on his dashboard were precise to the meter, punched in moments ago by the woman he had spent 6 months ignoring. Every instinct in his body screamed that it was a trap, that the maid had led him into an ambush, but the terrifying authority in her voice on the phone had overridden his paranoia. She had spoken with the weight of a general commanding an army, and for the first time in his life, the Dragon of Soul was following orders instead of giving them. They skidded to a halt outside Warehouse 19, a rusted, abandoned structure in the blind spot of the harbor's security grid, a location so obscure that even Tae-young didn't know it existed. This was the blind side Chloe had mentioned, a smuggler's haven. Tae-young didn't wait for his lieutenants to clear the perimeter. He kicked his door open, racking the slide of his pistol, and sprinted toward the corrugated metal entrance. "Breach!" he screamed, his voice raw with fear. His men swarmed behind him, flashlights cutting through the gloom, weapons raised and ready to slaughter anyone standing in their way. But there was no ambush. There was no gunfire. The cavernous space was eerily silent, smelling of sea salt and old oil. In the center of the vast, empty floor, illuminated by the headlights of the cars shining through the open bay doors, sat a single wooden chair. And sitting on it, shivering but alive, was his mother. The kidnappers had fled. They hadn't just left, they had vanished in a panic, leaving behind their cigarettes and half-drunk coffees, terrified by the threat Chloe had issued. They believed the butcher was coming, and they had chosen flight over death. Tae-young dropped his gun. The clatter of steel on concrete echoed through the warehouse as he fell to his knees, sliding the last few feet across the dirty floor. "Oma!" he choked out, the word tearing from his throat. She looked up, her eyes wide and wet, and collapsed into his arms. The relief was a physical blow, shattering the hard shell of the Mafia boss and leaving only a terrified son trembling in the dirt. He held her tight, burying his face in her shoulder, checking frantically for injuries, but there were none. She was untouched. The negotiation had been flawless. As his men secured the perimeter, securing the safety of the dragon's heart, Tae-young looked around the empty warehouse, the reality of the night settling in. The location was perfect. The timing was exact. The maid hadn't just guessed, she had orchestrated a masterclass in underworld diplomacy. The drive back to the penthouse was a blur of neon lights and exhausted silence, but Choi Tae-young's mind was racing faster than the engine of his armored sedan. His mother was safe, sedated and resting in the private wing of the hospital under the guard of 50 men, but the threat that had nearly destroyed his world had been neutralized not by his army, but by his housekeeper. When the elevator doors slid open to reveal the pristine, silent expanse of his apartment, the atmosphere felt charged, heavy with the weight of a secret that had been hiding in plain sight. The space was exactly as he had left it, cold, expensive, and immaculate. But the man walking into it was fundamentally changed. He was no longer the arrogance king of the underworld. He was a man who had just realized he was living in a cage with a tigress. He found Chloe in the living room. She was back in her uniform, the crisp white apron tied perfectly around her waist, her expression serene and vacant as she polished the same crystal decanter he had almost smashed in his rage hours earlier. The sight of her doing menial labor, the repetitive motion of the cloth against the glass, sent a jolt of cognitive dissonance through him. It was a terrifying performance. He watched her for a long moment, leaning against the doorframe, his shirt unbuttoned and stained with the grime of the warehouse, studying the woman he had dismissed as invisible. He looked at her hands, the same hands that had snapped his wrist and dialed a death threat to the triads, now moving with the gentle rhythm of a domestic servant. The deception was absolute, and it was breathtaking. "You knew the dialect," Tae-young said, his voice rough, breaking the quiet. He didn't shout. He didn't have the energy or the rank to shout at her anymore. Chloe didn't startle. She didn't look up. She simply continued polishing, her movements precise and calm. "I watch a lot of movies, sir," she replied, her voice soft, returning to the flat, subservient tone she had used for 6 months. It was a lie so blatant it felt like a slap in the face. Tae-young pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her, entering her personal space. But this time, there was no intimidation in his posture. There was only a desperate, gnawing curiosity. He stopped inches from her, forcing her to stop cleaning and meet his gaze. "You movies don't teach you high triad code," he whispered, searching her dark eyes for a crack in the armor. "Movies don't teach you how to negotiate a hostage drop in a blind sector. You saved my mother. You saved me." He reached out, almost touching her arm, but pulled back, unsure of the boundaries anymore. The power dynamic had completely reversed. The Korean Mafia boss was begging for the truth from the black maid. "Who are you, Chloe? And don't tell me you're just the help." For a second, the mask slipped. A small, enigmatic smile played on Chloe's lips, sharp and dangerous, hinting at a past filled with classified files and buried bodies. She placed the decanter down on the table with a soft clink and looked him dead in the eye, the air crackling with undeniable tension. "I'm whatever you need me to be, Mr. Choi," she said, her voice dropping to that lethal register one last time. "And right now, you need a clean living room." She turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway, leaving the Dragon of Soul standing alone in the light, terrified, intrigued, and completely obsessed. "I'm whatever you need me to be." That line just gave me chills. Who do you think Chloe really is? An undercover agent? A rival assassin? Or something even more dangerous? Give me your best theories in the comments below. And if you're obsessed with this chemistry as much as I am, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell, because part 2 is going to reveal secrets that will blow Tae Young's world apart.